I should not touch this.
You shouldn't touch that.
Okay, except for this.
Now we're getting live stream, so we should act like we do everything.
Just wait.
Okay.
Good to see you. One PA a few years ago. Don't worry, we'll do this all over dinner.
Okay, so CSDE acknowledges that we are located on Coast Salish territory, the traditional territory of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, I can't say that, and Muckleshoot nations and other native peoples. This land acknowledgement is but one small gesture in the ongoing process of working toward repairing and sustaining relations with Coast Salish lands, waters, and peoples, and their other than human kin. CSDE's commission logo from Native artist UW Professor Martin Oliver acknowledges these vital connections to Native peoples and territories. CSDE is extremely grateful for support from the National Institute for Child Health and Human Development, the College of Arts and Sciences, Evans School, School of Public Health, School of Social Work, the Business School, the Population Health Initiative, the E-Science Institute, and the Associate Provost for Research. I'm here to introduce Assad Assad, who is an assistant professor in sociology at Stanford University. His research focuses on social stratification, race, ethnicity, and immigration, surveillance, and social control in health. Today, he is presenting his work, City Surveillance, Deportation Threats, and Institutional Involvement among Latinos across US counties. And I just want to make a quick announcement for those joining on Zoom with Assad after the lecture to be patient because we have to change locations. And so it will take a little bit of time to get the Zoom working. So without further ado, take it away, Assad.
Thanks, Peter, for that mercifully short introduction. It's my favorite kind of intro. Thanks to all of you for being here, and thanks so much to CSDE for having me, and to all of the behind the scenes work that everyone has been making to make this possible. And also shout out to the Seattle weather for allowing me to wear my rain boots, which I had not worn for well over 2 years because of the pandemic and ongoing drought in California. So I choose to see the sunny side of the rain. All right. So this talk is an outgrowth from my book project, which I mentioned to Peter, but in 2 weeks will hopefully be forthcoming officially with Princeton University Press, and it will be off my desk forever, thank God. And in general, that project looks at how Latino immigrant families in Dallas, Texas lead daily life amid the ongoing threat of surveillance and punishment. That work is primarily ethnographic in orientation, also drawing primarily on in-depth interviews. But it posed several questions for me about how immigration surveillance and punishment work nationwide beyond the case of Dallas County, Texas. And that's what I want to talk to you all about today. There we go. So much of my work begins from the premise that surveillance and punishment are endemic to modern society. So none of us in this room even, are immune to state surveillance and punishment, but their burdens reflect pre-existing axes of inequality in the country. A growing body of research on surveillance and system avoidance suggests that individuals who are worried about state punishment are likely to avoid what are known as surveilling institutions, which is just a jargony phrase that describes institutions that keep formal records as a matter of course. Think hospitals, banks, schools, the workplace, and so on. Much of this work, especially that which is based on national data and quantitative analysis, proceeds in a pretty similar way, even as this research base is growing rapidly. It compares people with and without a sanctionable status, which is usually a criminal record. And then it evaluates whether these people with a criminal record have differences in the odds of involvement in surveilling institutions relative to people without a criminal record. And inevitably, it finds such differences, and it concludes that there is evidence of system avoidance when the people with a criminal record are more likely to avoid institutions that keep formal records. And that's because there is an assumption there about a fear of punishment, a fear of surveillance owing to that sanctionable status, being responsible for these differences. So I think this research is super important. It highlights a mechanism that through which state punishment can both create or worsen inequality. But I think it suffers from at least two limitations that short circuit our knowledge about this relationship. And the first is that it tends to infer the mechanism, which is fear of punishment, from both the independent variable, or having a criminal record, and the outcome variable, sort of the rates of institutional involvement. Now, what does that mean? It means that people put a lot of weight on the fact of having a criminal record, but they don't have an external source that links that criminal record to the threat of punishment that exists in that person's community. So just the fact of having a criminal record does not necessarily mean that the threat of punishment is equal across place. And so we need a measure that captures the threat of punishment that people encounter in daily life, and that correlates that with differences in institutional involvement between people with and without a criminal record or some other sanctionable status. I think the second big limitation is that there's limited attention to how dynamics of surveillance and system avoidance might vary across place. So in other words, this literature is somewhat aspatial, despite the suggestion that space matters a lot to how people navigate around the threat of policing in their local communities. So I would argue that we need a measure that moves beyond the structural characteristics of people's individual neighborhoods. So for example, that separates or that thinks about racial composition, neighborhood disadvantage, and crime rates as distinct from the threat of punishment that someone might encounter in their local communities, which might primarily actually emerge from something like policing, and the behavior of police and police officers in their local community. So in this article, we're focused on what we call the siting of surveillance, which we look at as place-based variation in the laws and policies that moderate the relationship between a sanctionable status and institutional involvement. So by the siting of surveillance, we are generally, again, focused on these laws and policies. And in general, we think that these laws and policies do a lot of work in structuring what the day-to-day features of surveillance look like in people's local communities across the United States, and therefore lead to differences in rates of institutional involvement across place, depending on what those features of surveillance in one's local community looks like. And so we argue that paying attention to the siting of surveillance does a lot of theoretical work to clarify the conditions under which a subordinated population that might be vulnerable to the threat of punishment can both become involved in surveilling institutions, but also examine the conditions under which they might actually begin to avoid those surveilling institutions. What it looks like to be involved in an institution in one place, say Dallas, Texas, might look very different from what it looks like to be involved in an institution in a place, let's say from like New York City. And that's what we're looking at here today. So we're motivated by research on policing in the United States. Now, although the doctors and the nurses and the social workers and the teachers who exist in surveilling institutions are thought to be in this broader literature responsible for the dynamics of surveillance that people encounter, it's not that you're scared of a doctor when you go to a surveilling institution. You're afraid of what the police might do if they find you at the doctor's office. So in other words, you're primarily concerned with the behavior of police officers in your local communities. And so that's what we're looking at today to motivate our existing research. And generally the idea that policing exists outside of surveilling institutions, and the behavior of police and the laws and policies that govern policing in your local community might do a lot to determine whether you actually even go to the surveilling institution to begin with. So we want to think about that moderating role as we think about the relationship between surveillance and system avoidance. Now, of course, policing contributes to to disparities by race and socioeconomic status across a variety of metrics. And there are two possible reasons for this that scholars think about. The first is what we might call the hyper-presence perspective, which is just the idea that policing concentrates in the places where racial and ethnic minorities live. And that's the reason why so many racial and ethnic minorities have criminal records. It's because, and why policing concentrates in those neighborhoods. And that's just because that's where police concentrate their efforts. And so if hyperpresence then is about the places in which policing is most likely to occur, there's another perspective, which is that we call the overactivity perspective, which is about the consequences of this hyper-present policing on the racial and ethnic minorities in a particular place. And here the research suggests that in poor and minoritized neighborhoods, policing increases residents' odds of negative physical and mental health outcomes. And these results also extend to people without the criminal record who might be racialized as having a criminal record by virtue of their proximity to a larger population. So the assumption, for example, that in a survey experiment of people with and without a criminal record, Black race was thought to be a stand-in for criminal record when race was hidden from employers reviewing job applications. But this research is a bit less clear about the effects of the context of policing on institutional involvement, and that's where we want to focus our efforts on today. So together, this quick review of the literature suggests at least two research questions that we investigate in this article. First is whether there is generalizable evidence to support findings from ethnographic research that the character of surveillance across place matters for both the incidence and degree of institutional involvement across counties. And second, if we do find such a relationship, what aspects of surveillance in particular moderate this relationship? So the context of study in this research is the case of racialized immigration policing. Although research on surveillance and system avoidance often invokes this research, or this case of racialized immigration policing. So here are two foundational articles by Alice Goffman and Sarah Brain, both of whom suggest that dynamics that they find among people with a criminal record should also manifest among people who are undocumented or otherwise immigrants on the run from the state. And yet there has been very little systematic study of this assumption. It's sort of just a throwaway sentence in the conclusion of a paper. And we think that there's a burgeoning body of scholarship on this question, but often they're complicated, they have data limitations, focusing in on a particular metropolitan area, as in the case of Los Angeles, or focusing on qualitative evidence of people who have family members who are detained in immigration detention without thinking more nationally about these dynamics more broadly. And so in particular, we want to pay attention to these vast differences across place that many scholars recognize as existing in the policies and practices that govern immigration enforcement. To live in California as an undocumented immigrant means something very different from living in Alabama or Arizona. And that's the reality that we want to pick up on as well. And in general, we're thinking about the broad effect of immigration enforcement on Latinos overall, in recognition of the fact, of course, that Latino non-citizens, especially the undocumented, are disproportionately affected by immigration policing. And yet there is a growing body of literature that suggests that actually these consequences extend to many Latinos, regardless of race or regardless of citizenship, precisely because of the conflation between race and citizenship in the context of Latino immigrants living in the United States. So given this review of the literature, we hypothesize that as immigration policing increases in a county, so too should the likelihood that Latinos overall are involved in surveilling institutions. And we expect this to manifest regardless of the legal status of the Latino population in question. So as immigration policing increases in a county, we expect to see we expect to see a commensurate increase in the likelihood that Latinos across nativity and citizenship should also be involved in surveilling institutions. So to put it more simply, where Latinos live is where immigration policing happens, all right? And then conditional on a county having Latinos involved in surveilling institutions. So only looking at the places where there are any Latinos involved in surveilling institutions, we expect that this degree of involvement will fall as immigration policing increases for Latinos overall, but also for each Latino subgroup, given the racialized consequences of immigration enforcement by nativity and citizenship in the United States. All right, so broadly, these hypotheses are aligned with both the hyperpresence and the overactivity perspective that we reviewed a little bit earlier, but thinking more specifically about the effects of immigration policing by nativity and citizenship. So I'll stop here for any quick questions. Yes?
Yeah, so you have two kinds of surveillance institutions, like the police and stuff that do it to you, or medical institutions, medication that you go to. Are these surveillance institutions, like the police, the ones that do it to you?
Right, so the outcome variable, which I'll talk about in just 1 second, is the surveilling institutions that you go to.
Okay.
But our argument is that whether you go to those institutions depends on what the police are doing in your community. All right. Very astute observation. So to answer these research questions and to test these hypotheses, we are drawing on the American Time Use Survey, which is fielded each year by the US Census Bureau. It's a time diary study. It's cross-sectional, meaning that it interviews people only once, but its respondents are regularly selected from a random sample of households that are concluding their participation in the current population survey. And what's great about the survey, among many things, is that it includes oversamples of the populations of interest in this study. So it oversamples Latino householders, and as well as households with and without young children. And finally, when you include sampling weights that account for sample construction and non-response and the days covered by the time diaries, which we'll talk about in just 1 minute, you receive a nationally representative portrait of the Latino population in the United States. So what is a time diary? A time diary documents where and how selected ATUS respondents spent the 24-hour period preceding the survey. So the respondents are asked from 4 a.m. the day before the survey to 4 a.m. the day of the survey, what they were doing, who they were with, and how long you were there, as well as where it took place, and so on and so forth. Then researchers go ahead and reclassify all of these activities into 17 broader categories, things like education, household activities, traveling, and so on and so forth, that span about 400 other detailed categories. And so we take our own classification scheme, in which I'll talk about in 1 moment, to reclassify this reclassification to align with these broader surveilling institutions. I think there are many good things about these data, but one less good thing is that we think it's a conservative measure of institutional involvement in the sense that it tells us where people spent their time the 24 hours before the survey, but we cannot account for instances, for example, where someone did not go to the doctor 24 hours ago, and yet they might have health insurance. And so we think this to mean that our estimates are conservative because likely there would be greater rates of institutional involvement in a context where someone has the opportunity to go to the doctor, but for example, didn't. And this is compounded by the fact, as you all might understand, especially given these last 2 years, most of us spend our 2/3 of our day sleeping, working, and eating. And you also see that in the American Time Use Survey. So we're really thinking about that extra gap in time of where you spend the remainder of your day, all right? So we have 3 main dependent variables. The first is what I call the incidence of institutional involvement. And this is just a binary indicator for whether a county has Latinos who are 18 or older, who report involvement in at least one of these surveilling institutions. The surveilling institutions reflect those that exist in the dominant research here, so medical, financial, educational, and labor market institutions, but they include a broad array of activities. So in typical research, we think about medical involvement as being whether you went to the doctor in the last 12 months. Here, we're thinking about whether you did any of these activities that are related to medical institutions, such as going to your personal doctor's appointment or going to one on behalf of your children, paying for healthcare, or even just talking to a medical professional, whether that's at a hospital or some urgent care clinic that you may not have otherwise picked up in the PSID, for example. Financial institutions, so many undocumented immigrants can't have bank accounts, but that doesn't mean they don't go to the doctor or to the banks, talk to bank managers or tellers or loan officers. So that's what we're picking up on here. And there are various other activities associated with educational and labor market institutions as well. And we find that about 25% of Latinos in a typical county year are involved in surveilling institutions, which means any one of these, at least one of these institutions in a given county year. So the next dependent variable are two measures of what we call the intensity of institutional involvement. So the first is a conditional proportion of institutional involvement when you drop all the counties where there is zero involvement, and instead you focus on those places where any such involvement occurs, and you estimate the rate of that involvement among those counties that have any of that involvement. And we construct a similar measure for how much time on average each county, Latinos in each county spend involved in surveilling institutions. And conditional on a county having any involvement in a surveilling institution, we find that about 71% of Latinos in a typical county year are involved in surveilling institutions, spending about 440 minutes traveling to or involved in a surveilling institution in a given county year. Yes.
If this is something you'll deal with later, just, tell me to shelve it. I'm wondering about the nature of enclaves and informal institutions that might exist, and to what extent they're not here or captured or are captured by your measures.
So I can't shelve it because I'm not dealing with it later, so I'll deal with it now. And it's a good observation, especially among this particular population. So it is the case that there are Latinx immigrants who might go to spiritual healers in their community, which may not be accounted for in these sort of more traditional metrics of medical institutional involvement in the US context. Certainly we have, in separate analyses, which I will not present today, we do present information on the extent of people's involvement in religious and volunteer organizations, but again, it's going to miss out on these less traditional forms of institutional involvement. And I think that means that we're probably missing out on forms of medical involvement, for example, that people think of as being really important to their local community. But the good news, it would mean that we're still underestimating the association.
Right.
And so I don't think it sort of is a threat to our estimates, but I think certainly means the story would be a little different, because there is ethnographic work that suggests that some of these massage healers that exist in Latinx communities, for example, in Kansas, I think Cecilia Menjivar has a paper on this, have different forms of, they suggest a different form of healthcare that itself is correlated with all kinds of negative health consequences in terms of Western standards of healthcare seeking and treatment. But we would not pick up on that here, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I guess I'm only thinking, well, there's also informal financial,
Right.
that these things might be protective of being surveilled, but not protective of other things.
Of course, yeah, absolutely. And so the best that we can do to account for sort of the enclave is to think about as I'll talk about in a moment, is the proportion of like Hispanic non-citizens in your county. Not exactly the same thing, but at the very least, we try to account for these broader demographic context in that regard. But I think what you're pointing out is an important limitation for us to note. Anybody else? Cool. So in general, we're presenting our analyses for all Latinos, regardless of nativity or citizenship status, where we have about 2,900 county years. But we construct separate county year estimates for US-born Latinos, the foreign-born, the naturalized, and non-citizens. You get different estimates because not all counties have like a Latino non-citizen who is surveyed, or you get a different sample size because not every county has a Latino non-citizen in a given year. Not all counties have a Latino naturalized citizen in a given year. But in general, we find, as I'll present this in just a second, solid evidence, I think, that supports our various hypotheses. So our key independent variable that we merge to the data from the American Time Use Survey comes from TRACK at Syracuse University, which is a measure of detainers, which I'll explain in a second, that is very typical in this research. So a detainer refers to a notice of the Department of Homeland Security within which ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, is housed. It issues to the police, so the DHS issues a notice to the police to hold someone they suspect is a non-citizen and therefore vulnerable to deportation for an additional 48 hours beyond their scheduled release from police custody. So you may have heard of these as just holds, an ICE hold, an ICE detainer. They're the same thing. And in general, we don't think of this as a measure of what immigration enforcement is doing in the county, but rather we take this as a measure of what local police are doing in a county. So the fact that a detainer request is issued means that the police have apprehended someone who is suspected of being a non-citizen. So regardless of whether that person ends up deported, our argument is that it tells us something about the local context of policing that just focusing on deportation rates itself would not necessarily give us. Now, the number of detainers in a particular county is very right skewed. I don't know if there are degrees of right skewedness, but it exists in detainer data. And it ranges from about 0 to about 18,000, with an average of about 371 detainers issued in a typical county year. So we log, and to account for the zeros, we add 1, transform the annual count of ICE detainers in the county, and their time varying, and we observe them 1 year prior to the metrics of institutional involvement that we have to minimize the possibility of reverse causality. So this gets at some of Sarah's questions earlier. We have many control variables that broadly align with existing research. So we can talk about the detainers measure in a second. We've chosen to go with the number of detainers in a county rather than a rate of detainers. There are many reasons for that, but I'm going to just pose that to the audience as a freebie Q&A question that we can talk about in a little bit. But we also think about percentage change in the county population, to think about demographic context, thinking about the Latinx population in a given county. We think about various measures of socioeconomic context, as well as the socio-legal context, to think more broadly about all of the factors that might confound the association that we're trying to estimate. And if you have a question as to whether something is missing that you really think we should control for, I'm all ears. Yes.
I mean, one question I have is, do you know, like, is the surveillance where they live, or is it where they're seeking all these different behaviors? Like,
So we don't know if the behaviors exist in the counties where they live, right? So you could go to a doctor in a neighboring county. So one of the big assumptions that we're making is that where you live proxies the context within which you're accessing surveilling institutions. And that's not a horrible assumption. So for example, generally you're going to school in your local county. Like where you live proxies the kind of school that you'll go to. You may not necessarily work in the county, for example, that you live in, but we think it holds more than it doesn't, although we can't be certain. Yeah, that's one of the big assumptions that we're making.
That's great. That's a good question. I mean, because counties vary so much in size, and then counties, so I can imagine very large counties where maybe that assumption holds, smaller counties where it may not hold, or counties that are very near metropolitan areas.
Yeah, so we control for the size of the county to try to get at some of these dynamics. We control, I don't know if it's listed here, but certainly we've tried measures of urbanicity as well to see whether sort of urbanicity explains the association, and the results are robust to that. We've also thought a bit about how we can get at this measure or get at this sort of assumption a bit more. So we're trying to see whether we can get finer grained time use data from the time use to see if people travel outside of their county. Although so far that has proved untenable. Yeah.
I'm also thinking of like sanctioned cities.
Oh, the sanctuary cities. Oh, yeah.
Cities, I mean.
Yeah. So
in like California, for example, there's quite a few where immigrants tend to like live in those areas because they feel a little bit safer. So I was just wondering how you control for that.
So you're jumping to my moderator analysis, but certainly sanctuary cities play a huge role here, or we expect them to. But spoiler alert, no. And the reason, and there are various reasons for that, and I think the big reason is that actually there's less evidence that people opt into people worried about deportation opt into sanctuary jurisdictions. It's more like sanctuary jurisdictions sort of pop up at the local level. And, often, and I think this is one of the arguments that I would make, is that they tend to be cited in places where it makes the dominant population feel good, but probably doesn't do much good for, the little or non-existent population that exists there. Certainly there are positive consequences, statewide in California to have a sanctuary jurisdiction. But I'll also say it's kind of a misnomer in the sense that just because a sanctuary policy exists doesn't mean local police are not collaborating with ICE. It sort of just means that it constrains the conditions under which local police and ICE collaborate. And so that, I think, is why the findings are robust even to considering what's happening with sanctuary jurisdictions. But more broadly, your question lends itself to a different question, which is an immigration enforcement more multidimensional than just detainers? And the answer is yes, we're working on it. So, all right, the model we're using is what's called a double hurdle model. So it assumes that an individual's decision on the extent of a participation in an activity is the result of two processes. So the first determines whether an individual is a zero type. So that means that they don't participate in an activity. So a simple example is, I want to study how much meat consumption exists in a particular country, but there's good reason to believe that a zero doesn't just mean a zero, it means that some people are vegetarian or vegan. And so we want to model that non-random process as well. And so that's hurdle one, so to determine who is the meat eater. And then hurdle two determines the extent of the participation in an activity if an individual is not a zero type. So to put it in lay terms, how much meat does a meat eater eat? All right, try saying that 5 times fast. So in our case, our hurdle one estimates a binomial probability model to predict the likelihood that a county's Latino residents exhibit any involvement in surveilling institutions. And then hurdle two estimates a zero truncated fractional logit model to predict the conditional proportion of that involvement. And a zero truncated Poisson model to predict the time spent involved only among the counties where that involvement exists. All right, so we drop all zeros and we focus only on the extent of participation among people with any such participation. Questions? Because now I get to show you the figures. It's the fun part. All right. So this graph summarizes some of our core results from hurdle one. On the x-axis, you have the number of detainers in a county. On the y-axis, we have the probability that Latinos in that county report any involvement in a surveilling institution. The red bars do not include control variables. The blue bars do include control variables. I'm only going to interpret the blue bars, though if you want to play it, if you want to talk about sort of what's happening with the inclusion of the control variables, I'm happy to do that in the Q&A. So moving from left to right, we see that the blue bars, of course, get higher as the number of detainers in a place increases. So substantively, what does that mean? Is that at zero detainers, about 15.5% of Latinos in counties with zero detainers are involved in surveilling institutions in a given year. That rate increases to about 32% relative to the zero detainer counties in counties that have 100 detainers, to 44.5% in counties that have 1,000 detainers, and to about 59% in counties with 10,000 detainers. So what we're finding here is that immigration policing increases in a place, so too does the likelihood that that place has Latinos involved in surveilling institutions. And we don't think that's super surprising or actually counterintuitive at all. We just think immigration enforcement concentrates its resources in places where Latinos live. And that's what we're trying to establish here. So what we're doing in these next 4 charts, they're much smaller, but focus only on the blue bars. We find similar results when we look at the US-born Latinos who are here. Again, as they concentrate in a place, more immigration enforcement exists there. We find a similar dynamic among the foreign-born. We do not find a dynamic among Latino naturalized citizens. So as the proportion of Latino naturalized citizens in a place increases, we do not find a similar dynamic that policing is cited in places where the Latino naturalized citizens live. but we do find a dynamic among the non-citizens. So taken together, we think that this generally finds support for our first hypothesis, the hyperpresence perspective, that as immigration policing increases in a place, so too does the odds of finding Latinos overall, but as well as the US born, the foreign born, and the non-citizens, more likely to be involved in surveilling institutions. Okay. So now we're jumping to hurdle 2. So remember, we've dropped now the 0 counties, and we're only looking at counties that have any Latinos involved in surveilling institutions. The setup is somewhat similar for these charts. X-axis is the number of ICE detainers. The Y-axis is now the predicted probability or predicted proportion involved, conditional on a county having any involvement. And in counties that issue 0 detainers, we estimate that about 85% of Latinos are involved in surveilling institutions in the 24-hour period before the ATUS survey. But as detainers increase in a place, so once you get to 100 detainers, it falls to about 75%, to about 68% in counties that have 1,000 detainers, and to about 60% in counties with 10,000 detainers. So here we find support, we argue, for our second hypothesis, with the caveat that even at the highest levels of immigration enforcement, the majorities of Latinos are still involved in daily life, which tells us something, I think, that research on system avoidance itself did not necessarily anticipate, given the broader assumption about how policing and surveillance operate in this context. Now, when we look at this by Latino subgroup, we find a similar dynamic among the US born that as immigration policing picks up, rates of institutional involvement fall. Find a similar dynamic among the foreign born overall. We also find a dynamic here among the naturalized, who actually, remember, immigration policing does not concentrate where they tend to be involved in daily life, and yet we find evidence that they decrease their rates of institutional involvement fall as immigration policing picks up in a place. But in the fully adjusted model, we do not find an association among Latino non-citizens. And so we have a couple of ideas about this, but in general, we think that this means that Latino non-citizens do not vary their day-to-day involvement in surveilling institutions in response to localized dynamics of policing as immigration enforcement. We think something else might be at play, which we'll talk about in a second. And then when it comes to how much time folks spend involved in surveilling institutions, in general, we find no effect, that the rate is flat in the fully adjusted and the unadjusted models for all Latinos. Rate is also flat for the US born and the foreign born. Latino naturalized citizens do decrease the amount of time that they spend involved in surveilling institutions. We think this is in effect sort of a more selective, circumscribed form of involvement. Perhaps they don't go out as much as they used to, but they still do maintain some form of involvement across levels of immigration enforcement. And again, we find no effect among the non-citizens. All right, now there was a really good question in the back. Tell me your name.
Isaiah.
Isaiah asked a really good question about what about sanctuary jurisdictions? Well, we actually think that's our third moderator. So we'll get there in a second. But there are a couple of sort of possible moderators related to immigration enforcement that we wanted to think about a bit more systematically. And the first is because we like to do, you'll see that there are 3 Ps here. We like to keep the alliteration going. So first is we have predictability. And predictability, we argue, sort of refers to the federal changes in immigration enforcement that prioritized arrests of non-citizens with what you might call serious criminal records. So before 2011, policy was somewhat unrestricted in its scope. You could deport anyone that you found and decided you wanted to deport. Then John Morton, who was then director of ICE in 2011 or 2012, said, hey, we're going to start prioritizing by criminal record now. So only deport those who have serious criminal records. That policy was then formalized in 2014 by the Priority Enforcement Program. And then, as you all might know, the Trump administration sort of went back the pre-2011 unrestricted targeting of immigrants, regardless of your criminal record. So we just did an interaction term in our main model. I know there's a lot here, but I'm gonna walk you through it. And we also are looking at high versus low enforcement counties to see what might be happening. So here we've got the low enforcement counties looking at ICE detainers. And generally what we find is that in the counties with the low levels of immigration policing, we generally see that uncertainty about immigration policing matters. And so when ICE started prioritizing by criminal record, that's the blue bar, we saw decreases in Latinos' institutional involvement. But when that policy became formalized, that's the red bar, we saw no change to rates of institutional involvement relative to the pre-2011 period. But then during the Trump administration, that's the gray bar, you see that rates fell precipitously for all subgroups, whether all Latinos, the US born, the foreign born, and the non-citizens. Then looking at the high enforcement counties, you're generally finding null effects with the exception of all Latinos in the first bucket for the Morton memo period. But really the only action here is among the Trump period. So where Trump, when Trump was elected and assumed power, we see that there was a substantial decrease in the probability that a county would have Latinos involved in surveilling institutions. It fell by about 17 points among all Latinos, and there were similar decreases across groups except for the naturalized. So to us, this suggests that predictability, sort of as measured by not having a president setting immigration policy that is somewhat capricious, matters a whole lot to how Latinos in the United States navigated around their institutional involvement. Yes.
So the results you showed us before these time periods, those included all of.
Yeah, there were just year fixed effects, and so we get rid of the year fixed effects, and now we're interacting these time periods. And we also thought about doing it by the presidential administration, sort of Bush, Obama. Well, really, it would just be Obama 1, Obama 2, and Trump. And generally, the results are similar. So then when we look at hurdle 2, so thinking about the intensity of institutional involvement, you actually see the effects flip. That in general, rather than sort of negative or no effects, you generally see that across subgroups in the low enforcement counties, the predictability that are associated with these different policy changes leads to almost a secular increase in rates of the incidence of institutional involvement across counties. And you might wonder, but Assad, why are they increasing among the Trump administration? Isn't he evil? Well, the answer is that these sort of reflect the localized dynamics that we argue sort of are sort of, even as the federal trend, as the national level was turning somewhat punitive, we think that this is evidence that the localized dynamics of trying to protect those in your local community from mayors and other sort of county policies was taking hold to increase rates of institutional involvement during the Trump administration. And you also find a similar dynamic in the higher enforcement counties. And so again, we think that on the one hand, in low enforcement counties, sort of predictability at the local level matters a whole lot. But in this sort of higher enforcement county, we generally think that there is a certain degree of immigration enforcement that Latinos who live there will tolerate. They sort of accept that there's risk built into their local community, with the exception of in the Trump era where those localized dynamics really matter, which is why that's really the only significant increase that you find across this in that particular plot. All right, so that was predictability. But Assad, what about punitiveness? What about if a county experienced a 1/2 or more standard deviation increase in the number of detainers in the prior year, you might ask. And that's the question we ask, so I'm putting it to your mouth, sorry about that. So we wanted to evaluate whether the trend in immigration enforcement mattered, right? Whether people could pick up whether a county was becoming more punitive. And we evaluated what was happening there with an interaction term with detainers. And again, we generally find not a whole lot happening in the low detainer counties. Even as these low enforcement counties become more punitive, there's not really any sort of meaningful effect in the incidence of institutional involvement. We do find an effect among the higher enforcement counties on the incidence of institutional involvement, that among all Latinos, the places that became more punitive tended to have more Latino residents who are involved in daily life. But at the same time, we don't really find evidence of that for the other Latino subgroups. So we think this is more of a racialization story rather than sort of a nativity story. Of course, those two things are correlated and overlap and co-constituent, mutually constitutive. So now looking at intensity, again, we're not finding a whole lot of action with punitiveness on whether people decrease their rates of institutional involvement as a place becomes more punitive in a low enforcement county. But you do find an effect among Latino non-citizens in the higher enforcement counties, that as their counties become more punitive, they are less likely to be involved in surveilling institutions, but only as the trend is toward punitiveness rather than sort of any sort of day-to-day increase that might be happening. So that's predictability, and that was punitiveness, and we did predictability. But what about sanctuary jurisdictions? What about this partial implementation of immigration enforcement? And here we measure that with whether a county has a sanctuary policy in place that limits police cooperation with ICE. Again, it limits police cooperation. It does not prohibit police cooperation. All right. And again, when we look to see where these sanctuary policies take hold, we generally find no effect. They're not really happening in places where Latinos are more involved in surveilling institutions, whether they're foreign born or US born. In these low enforcement counties, it's just kind of flat. But we do find evidence that in these higher enforcement counties, the incidence of institutional involvement among the foreign born falls in counties that have sanctuary, these higher enforcement counties that have sanctuary jurisdictions. So we're not really finding a whole lot of net gain toward the institutional involvement for any of these groups. We just sort of, they tend to be in places where Latinos are no more or less likely to be involved in daily life, and certainly in counties that are less likely to have foreign-born Latinos, and in particular, the naturalized. And then when we look at intensity, though, we do find that there is a positive effect for the naturalized in both low and high enforcement counties. So even though they tend to be less involved in counties that have sanctuary policies, when a county does have sanctuary policies, and people are involved in daily life, they tend to increase their involvement. So that's some good news, right? Some limited good news among the naturalized, but we don't really see anything happening among the other subgroups. So what does all of this mean? Thank you for bearing with me so far. I actually don't know how much time has elapsed. How am I doing on time? Perfect. I will be done in a few minutes. So in general, regarding the incidence of institutional involvement, we find that immigration policing concentrates in these counties where Latinos, in particular the US born, the foreign born, and non-citizens exhibit a higher incidence of involvement in surveilling institutions. So we generally find support for our first hypothesis, this sort of hyper-presence perspective for everyone except the naturalized. And then regarding intensity, we find that high levels of enforcement correlate to lower levels of institutional involvement across counties for everyone except the non-citizens. We find mixed evidence for them there. And then regarding the possible moderators, sorry for that. We find evidence that predictability, punitiveness, and maybe the partial implementation matters for where the counties where Latinos tend to be involved in daily life. But regarding intensity, really we only find that punitiveness does some talking here, and in particular just for some restricted subgroups of non-citizens, of Latinos, in particular the foreign-born, and that should say non-citizens. So what does all this mean? We think that attention to the citing of surveillance clarifies some of these localized dynamics of surveillance and punishment that play out in daily life. It tells us something different about how people make calculations or trade-offs about how much exposure to surveillance they are willing to tolerate, even as the threat of punishment in their place or of residence picks up. And we think that this more accurately reflects the everyday dynamics and trade-offs that people make, that ethnographic research suggests exists, and yet quantitative research on surveillance system avoidance has yet to pick up on to some degree. And for us, we think it suggests that we should pay more attention to place-based structural dimensions of surveillance. In particular, these ideas of predictability, punitiveness, and partial implementation that can both enable or constrain institutional involvement. And the reason for that is because it tells us something different than just inferring that someone having a criminal record or someone being vulnerable to deportation, sort of their behavior is inherent to their status. Rather, we actually think their behavior is external to their status. It sort of depends on the larger sort of localized dynamics of laws and policies on the ground that they are both aware of and strategize around as they sort of make trade-offs about how to take care of themselves, how to go to work, how to go to school, and also how to take care of their children. And finally, although we don't test some of these claims here, some of this came up in some of the questions earlier, we think that these findings urge us to redirect our attention not just toward the consequences of institutional avoidance, but also to the consequences of institutional involvement, right? So the fact of institutional involvement, which is what we talked about throughout the presentation, tells us nothing about the quality of that involvement. So, it could be the case that you are involved in in medical institutions, but if that's urgent care, if it reflects sort of, some of these healers that maybe Sarah was alluding to earlier, perhaps it reflects inconsistent care rather than sort of more consistent medical care. That suggests a different pathway through which health-related inequality might be generated. At the same time, the fact that you're involved in a school or a workplace tells us nothing about whether that's a for-profit school or whether it is sort of an exploitative job. And so at the same time, paying attention to the quality of this involvement and what it means for your life chances, we think will reveal new insights into the inequality generating processes of institutional involvement. So I'll stop there. Thank you all for your patience and willingness to listen.
So thanks for a wonderful talk. So now we'll begin our Q&A. So if you're on Zoom and you have a question, please put it into the Q&A search box. If you have a question here, you can just raise your hand because I can see it. So maybe we'll start with in person and then we'll move to online. Yeah.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for the talk. It was wonderful. I learned so much from you. The question I had is that a lot of the kind of variables you talk about are rooted in physical spaces. But I think nowadays all of our lives are so virtual. And a lot of, I think, formal surveillance happens at a virtual level. So I'm wondering if you think there's any relationship with how virtual interactions can influence the lived experiences, detainment, deportation of non-citizens.
Aria, right?
Aria.
So the data that the years on display in this article are sort of in the before times, right? In the times absent virtual interaction, or where virtual interaction was more minimized. That's sort of the pre-COVID era. If I were to sort of extend the time frame into the current moment, how do I think this plays out? I think there are a couple of ways. Thing one is I think you have a better, we all know this, right? You have a greater control of the self that you present in these virtual spaces. There's less risk because you're at home. And so to some degree, you're able to sort of log on to Zoom or whatever other virtual platform might exist. You can blur out your background so you can hide if your house is messy or your kids are fighting or doing whatever. And so in those cases, it's perhaps less fraught to sort of make yourself visible to a doctor or a social worker or whoever on that space. And certainly you're avoiding the localized context of policing because you're not actually going outside your house. And so I would say that perhaps in the current moment, there are a couple of things. I would say perhaps it means that involvement was a little higher during the pandemic is what I would expect. But at the same time, I also think that it might cut the other way, especially if you're talking about a subordinated population. It could have been a little lower because even though the pandemic was raging, depending on where you lived, you still had to go out in public to access welfare assistance. You still had to go meet with a caseworker every so often. So I would also say that, it really depends on where you live, right? Sort of how Palo Alto dealt with the pandemic is different from where my family in Milwaukee, Wisconsin lives, and it's jarring to see what I'm willing to tolerate versus what they're willing to tolerate,
I will actually respectfully argue with you about that.
Please, yeah.
Anecdotally, just anecdotal
Oh, yeah.
evidence. Pandemic work that I was running the graduate program at our international studies, and most of our students are international students. And they were telling me that everyone else was interacting on Zoom, and they were worried about interacting on Zoom because they thought their brothers getting into their Zoom and talk to them. And my first response was I wanted to say, oh no, they can't. Because this is also time that conspiracy theories are flying around like crazy because times are uncertain. And so I can also see anecdotally, people might be more afraid of virtual spaces because somehow you might be able to sneak in and
Yeah. Look, I'm someone who will not fight anecdotes because I think the book that I wrote is primarily interview based, and so I think there are a range of meanings that people can have about different forms of surveillance, even among the same form of surveillance. And I think it tells us something different about social location, what particular group is sort of fearing the surveillance. It tells us something different about what forms of surveillance that you're worried about, what kinds of interactions you are apprehensive over. And so I won't debate you over it, but certainly I'll say, I think both can be true. And I think it just depends on sort of the social location of the population in question, the kinds of interactions that we're dealing with, and what we think the relationship is between social location, surveillance, and institutional involvement.
sorry, can you introduce yourself? Yeah.
I'm Lizzie Pelletier. I'm a PhD student at the Evans School in Public Policy. And I'm interested in how you thought about political involvement. So I don't remember if that was one of your involvement variables, but it seems like there could be some maybe reverse causality or just a dynamic where engagement in the political system could even act to change some of these systems of surveillance in counties. And maybe some of the variables you're thinking about could be correlated with civic engagement and that kind of thing. So just interested in how you're thinking about that.
Spot on, right? I think it's true. There is a lot of evidence that suggests, especially among the US born, that where immigration enforcement concentrates, the US born tend to become more politically involved and mobilized. And so there's a great paper by Ariel White, who's a political scientist at MIT, also was a wonderful colleague during graduate school. Shout out to Ariel. And she has this paper called When Threat Mobilizes. And her argument is that as policing picks up, or as immigration enforcement picks up in a county, that's where you see people who have power, in this case, the US born Latinos who are eligible to vote, and perhaps also the naturalized citizens, they tend to become more involved in the political process. But she views much of this work thinks about things like voting, right? So individual level voting behavior. We have an updated analyses that we'll have ready probably next week. We are thinking about whether your local county vote share for Trump or Obama, or Romney, sorry, we kept it on the Republican side. Your Republican vote share over time matters for the dynamics that we observe here, and the findings are robust. And part of that is we think that the political culture of a place more or less stays just what it is, and so although it is true that maybe localized dynamics of protest or voting do manifest and do perhaps try to mobilize around some of these issues, we don't necessarily think that upsets this broader day-to-day dynamic. There's also a really great book called Holding Fast by Michael Jones Correa and James McCann that does show that at least during the Trump era, greater deportation threat, and in particular, anger and frustration toward Trump, predicted a doubling in the Latino, both US born citizen and naturalized population in protests against Trump. It went from 10% to 20%, which is, I think, a really wonderful metric to observe, but I also think that it tends to be the exception rather than the rule, protest and political mobilization in this, at least among this particular group.
maybe one last question if it's
Yeah,
quick.
it's a really good question from Jelani, faculty in the sociology department. Couldn't help but think about some of your qualitative work, and just the question really thinking about is, how does your level of institutional involvement sort of matter to your legibility or lack thereof to the state? And I'm wondering if that sort of is playing a role in sort of the ability or willingness to engage in sort of these risk-making decisions potentially, right? So yeah, that's one.
You've read my work too closely, you know. I think it does play a role. We tried to test whether we could distinguish between non-citizens who are likely permanent residents and those who are likely undocumented. We tried to impute legal status, and it has all kinds of nasty assumptions that we had to make. But in particular with these data, the American Time Use Survey, it requires us to only rely on like 30% of the full sample. And we just weren't comfortable doing that. But I do think that, sort of legibility does play a role in a couple of ways. So thing one is that as you live here for a longer period of time, you're more likely to understand just how things work. And so you sort of figure out the system. That's one thing. Thing two would be that, maybe you arrive as maybe I arrive as just like a single man. I don't have a family. I don't have any kids or anything like that. And so I just go to work. I try to avoid the doctor because I heard they could deport me for that. But then all of a sudden I start to have a partner and kids. And all of a sudden, I'll go to jail if I don't take my kids to the doctor. If the social worker finds me with my kids not getting vaccinated, or if I don't go to parent-teacher conferences, or my kid misses school too much, and so on and so forth. And that's actually, preview, spoiler alert, that's actually the point of my book, is that, these more micro everyday forms of surveillance are threatening in and of themselves. And it's a way that people manage both the social roles that they have as parents, as immigrants, as workers, and so on and so forth, but also as people worried about deportation. So I think legibility plays a huge role. I just think that people will allow themselves to be legible day to day, even as they're still worried about these longer term effects of legibility toward the immigration system and what it means to be legible to an immigration officer or someone reviewing your naturalization application, rather than what it means to be legible to a teacher or a doctor or a social worker.
Right, so thank you very much. Join us next week when Tyson Brown gives a talk. And for those of you who are joining us via Zoom, just be patient. We have to change physical space, so that it might take time to get the link working. So
thank you all.
Thank you very much.